Hi, Byron.
Hi, David.
How are you?
I'm fine, and you?
I'm pretty good. Well, I'm recovering from last night's Radio and TV Correspondents Association dinner where Dick Cheney was marginally funny.
So he said he could see the whites of your eyes, right?
Yes, I thought he should come in and say, I'm happy to be here, and I've checked my gun at the door. And I didn't realize that Dick Cheney was going to show up at this thing. That we should tell our viewers, about 2,300 of your closest media friends pack into the Washington Hilton once a year for this gala dinner, which comes a month before the little more famous White House Correspondents' Dinner.
I have to confess that I wasn't at the one last night. So.
Yeah, I mean, so I usually go to one, not both, a year, and and usually the president shows up. 2 years ago, he showed up and he made jokes about missing WMDs, and others took offense too. Most people, though, happened to laugh at it. Last night, the president was spring flinging in Cancun, and Cheney came, and gosh, I couldn't believe that not one out of the 2,300 people did not show up in an orange vest.
Well, that didn't really work for Dana Milbank when he tried it on MSNBC. So, I think that one's been tried and tested and found wanting.
Well, let me welcome you to Blogging Heads TV as we continue our mission to expand ideologically with a greater diversification. Even if you still are just another white guy journalist from Washington.
I'm the ideological outreach.
Yes, well, we had Jim Pinkerton, and if I have these very sensitive calculations correctly, you are probably a little bit more conservative than Jim Pinkerton.
A little bit more conservative and probably a number of inches shorter, too.
Yeah, well, that goes for all of us.
We should say that Jim Pinkerton, I think, is, 6'7"?
Something like that. Yeah. It doesn't show on Blogging Heads TV.
That's right.
We're all just about 4 inches high.
I have no body below this part.
Now, of course, the big news, the big political news in Washington this week, let's get right to it, was the congressional hearings on Section 301 trade disputes, right?
Oh, yeah.
No,
huge.
It was actually Andrew Card leaving the chief of staff position of the White House. Right. And I noticed that you are the National Review's White House correspondent. I'm just the Washington editor of The Nation. And so as the White House correspondent for National Review, that venerable conservative publication, give me your take on Card's departure. Was he pushed, or did he leave because he was just so gosh darn tired?
Well, the story is that he was so gosh darn tired, and you've seen all these stories about how he gets up at 4 in the morning and is at the White House at 5:30, and he doesn't leave till 8 or 9 at night, and then he was exhausted. And, that's true, but I'm sure he was exhausted a year ago. And the other thing is that Josh Bolten, who is replacing him, is even more of a workaholic, and he was working for the Bush campaign in 1999. So Josh Bolten has been, working 24/7 for the last 7 years. So it's doubtful that Josh Bolten is any fresher than Andrew Card is. So that's not really the issue here.
So what is this all about?
Well, what it is I think that the Bolton change itself is no big change at all. But if it is the change that begins the change, that is, if Bolton has an assignment to kind of rework the White House staff, then it could be a more significant change. But just as it is, exchanging Card for Bolton is just no big deal.
I thought it showed they didn't understand, at least initially, the meaning of fresh blood. Fresh blood means you have an anemic entity, and you need blood from the outside. You don't take blood from one, tired, bad organ and put it in another one. That's not fresh blood.
Right.
And so the argument had been, one that I didn't make. I didn't think it was. I thought it was kind of pointless that the Bush White House needed, an outside perspective. They needed to widen the horizons and bring somebody in who was not tied into the Bush crowd, who maybe wasn't personally invested in how they had done things up to now.
Right.
And certainly that's not Josh Bolten. As director of the OMB, he's been responsible for all the budget issues. And every time the Washington Post is running an editorial, blaming Bush for being completely irresponsible and running up $12 trillion in debt, and not being honest about it in the budget numbers, that's really an attack on the reality perception, at least from their position, of Josh Bolten.
Yeah.
So he's not so I don't know if he has a mission to shake things up, perhaps. But then who is giving him that mission? And the larger question still is, to keep with our blood metaphor here, the patient remains the same, and the policies remain the same. I mean, nothing is going to change in Iraq for good or bad. Then does it really matter who the chief of staff is?
Well, I'm sure you're making all of your suggestions from a sincere desire for the best wishes of the Bush administration. But I agree with you. Look, the change for Bolton doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make a huge bit of difference. The real question is going to be actually what happens with Karl Rove, who is at least putatively Josh Bolton is his boss.
Right.
And so what's going to happen there? We all know that Rove's fate has still not been decided or at least announced in any way by Patrick Fitzgerald, who's still apparently investigating Rove in the CIA leak case. By the way, I believe the Rove side believed that they would probably hear something up or down from Fitzgerald in a couple of weeks, and that was like 4 or 5 months ago. So I don't know why this is taking so long, but anyway, Rove is still under kind of a cloud there.
Yeah, and that may never change to the degree that sometimes some prosecutors do not close investigations until the trials that they have are over and done with, because you never know what might come up along the way. So there's nothing, there's no guarantee that there will come a point when Fitzgerald will say to Rove or his attorney that you're absolutely in the clear now. So this cloud may hover until the Libby trial, if not even longer than that. So
Libby trial being scheduled to begin in January of 2007.
Yes. So it could be a long time.
Yeah.
In any event.
But anyway, so what happens to Rove and all this? I just don't know. And clearly, the clamor from a lot of Republicans as well as Democrats who really weren't speaking in the White House's best interest, but from Republicans who were, was that they do get somebody new in there, and by that we mean someone who didn't work for the president up until now.
Yes.
And, look, the good thing about Bush is his loyalty, and sometimes the bad thing about Bush is his loyalty. And I think, a number of Republicans now are saying, look back at Ronald Reagan. When Ronald Reagan needed to cut somebody loose, he did it, or he had somebody else do it.
Or Nancy did it.
Yeah, he had somebody else do it. So,
but the one thing
can Bush do that?
One analysis I've heard, though, is that Republicans who are clamoring for change in the White House, it's not just because they're concerned about the Bush presidency. They're concerned about their own backsides.
Sure.
And that one thing they'd like to do is have the press focused on change at the White House, a new run of stories, a honeymoon, at least for a couple of weeks, which will, put off 3 more weeks of bad stories about Iraq or the Republican disarray, which is now becoming a cliche, as had the Democrats.
Right.
Disarray.
Well, Republicans were, certainly around the Port Steele, they had this big spate of distancing themselves from Bush and sending Bush telegrams that said, not only no, but hell no, and that kind of stuff.
Right.
But I think, I talked to a very senior Republican in the Senate shortly after that, and he said, well, they kind of got that out of their system, and what we need to realize, we Republicans in the Senate and the House, is that our fate is very much tied to the president's, and what we need to do in the next number of months is try to get the president's job approval rating up. So he was clearly worried. There's 2 ways of looking at this 2006 election. Democrats want to make it a referendum on Bush, and Republicans don't. They want to make it a choice between high taxes and low taxes, and victory in Iraq and defeat in Iraq. So the question is who's going to be able to prevail in that. And Republicans now, I think, on the Hill realize that they're kind of locked in the trunk of George W. Bush's car.
Well, I think that's true, and he's still at the driver's wheel.
Yeah, right.
This makes a wonderful segue to our next segment. If Mickey was here, he would ring a bell. We don't have a bell. We just have a metaphorical bell. But that would be, talking about Republicans in disarray, immigration.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of the scene at the end of Reservoir Dogs, when all the gangsters are in the same room together, and they're literally in a circular firing squad, and one guy fires, and they all end up going down. It really seems that there are fierce rivalries and tensions and conflicts here more on the Republican side than the Democratic side, and I don't see a bridge yet that any of them are willing to walk over. I mean, of course, the House passed a bill a couple of months ago that called for fierce enforcement in building a wall, had nothing in it about guest workers or enhances path to citizenship. And the Senate the past week, we saw the Republican Judiciary Committee, pass a bill, more Democrats than Republicans on it for sure, but was much more in line with what Bush has been asking for, which has some guest worker provision and was closer to the McCain-Kennedy bill. Is there any way for Republicans to avoid just a bloody mess on this fight?
No.
I'm happy to hear that.
The president seems determined, to stick with his side of this. I think one possible sort of way out, National Review has editorialized, and I think that the headline of the editorial was enforcement first. That doesn't mean you can't do something afterwards, but it's got to be enforcement first. On the other hand, there's this realization, George Will wrote today, you can't deport 11 million people.
Yes.
Did you read the part about where he said how many buses it would take to deport illegal aliens? 200,000 buses in a caravan stretching bumper to bumper from San Diego to Alaska. So, that's not going to happen.
But that does, that is the, I won't call it an elephant, but it is the issue that half of the Republicans, the ones who just focus on the wall and enforcement, just refuse to address. Some of them actually do call for the deportation of everybody who's not here legally. And it just seems to me that any solution to the immigration problem we have that doesn't address the 12 million people who are here now is not a solution.
Right. Well, let me ask you this. I agree that there is Republican division on this. Right. And then I think there is also, a pretty strong public sentiment in the direction of enforcement. Mm-hmm. Since Republicans are divided, are Democrats unified on this?
No, I don't think they are, but I think right now, because they don't control either body of the Congress, and most, as you know, in the last year or two, the leadership, particularly on the House side, has been pretty strong-armish when it comes to
But how would you characterize the Democratic division on this? Is it half and half, or how would you characterize?
I don't think we know, because they've been kind of pushed out of the process. We do know.
Well, they're laying low.
But they are laying low. No, but on the McCain-Kennedy, I would assume that most of the party, I'll pull a guess out of my backside. 70%, 80%, maybe as low as 60% would be behind the McCain-Kennedy bill.
Right. All right. So my question is this. If the public is very pro-enforcement, and Republicans are kind of divided, and half of them are more in tune with the public and half of them are not, and if most Democrats are not in tune with the public on this, how does it make this a winning issue for Democrats? Divisions on the Republican side, or no?
No, I'm not sure it makes it a winning issue for Democrats. I think it may make it just a losing issue for Republicans. You talked earlier about the Republican need to boost George Bush's ratings for the election. If you have a big mess here that at the end of the day people are angry at him as well, then that certainly doesn't help from a pure political perspective.
Yeah.
Linda Chavez, my friend who I often do TV with, says that she thinks that the polls, and I don't know if this is true or not, it may just be wishful thinking on her part, that the polls are at this point accentuating the visceral feeling amongst those who care for enforcement, and that in terms of, if you ask people, if you don't ask the question, what do you care about it this way, and just ask people, what do you care about in general, there's a lot less anger and passion for across the public in a wide sense for walls and strict enforcement than you get if you ask, do you support these things in particular? So it's certainly true that the people who care about this care about it a lot, and talk show, radio, and things like that really create a tremendous echo chamber. I'm still not sure how it plays about across across the public, and I think right now the Democrats should care, because they should care about all matters of public policy, but may not need to care about it politically because they're just not on the court.
Well, but the thing is that elections are always the one guy or the other guy, and so Democrats in the districts in the House districts and the states, Senate states, in which this is an issue, they're going to have a position. So, listen, I do not know which way. I do know that it divides Republicans. I have no problem saying that. But I do not know which way this cuts electorally this November.
No predictions from me either. We'll see what happens. Although my one prediction is I don't think they'll be able to produce a bill this year. I'll be very surprised if they can, as I said earlier, bridge these differences. Let's move on to topic number 3, and that is I wrote a blog earlier this week, or a piece for TomPaine.com, in which I zeroed in on a phrase that the president used at his press conference and has been using before and after. That's his press conference of last week, in which, when people talk about the warrantless wiretapping that the NSA conducted on the basis of his approval, he called it a terrorist surveillance project.
Right.
And he said of critics, well, if you don't like this, then we should have elections about it, and you should get out there and just say that you're opposed to having a terrorist surveillance project. You just don't like to have a terrorist surveillance project. You should just be up front about this. And Dick Cheney, I think, even went further down the road by saying, it's an outrageous proposition that we should protect the communications of Al-Qaeda. So he's basically, if you're opposed to this, you're in favor of protecting Al-Qaeda communications. After starting with the caveat that it's always tough to throw around the term Orwellian, then proceeded to call this type of language Orwellian, because it's not as if any of the critics don't want to surveil and penetrate and capture communications of Al-Qaeda, suspected Al-Qaeda terrorists, but they want to have certain procedures and guidelines for doing so, and to go through the FISA court, which has been set up, and that to say that if you're opposed to this, you're opposed to the terrorist surveillance protection. It does strike me as being, somewhat demagogic, and to say if you're opposed to this, you want to protect the communications, because you look at the logic behind this. Right now, even the Bush administration says it will not engage in warrantless wiretapping of domestic communications. If you have one Al-Qaeda suspect talking to somebody who's in America, talking to somebody else in America, it only will intercept a conversation without a warrant if it goes overseas. So, using their own standards, one could point to that and say, you're against a terrorist surveillance project. You want to protect the communications of Al-Qaeda when they happen in America. So what's wrong with my argument on this?
Well, look, I think the question is not whether it's Orwellian or not Orwellian, but whether it's legal or whether it's not legal.
No.
Legality means something.
Legality, but I'm talking about the president and his use of language to support a policy that
David,
is arguable.
Look, the president is using political hyperbole, which is exactly what Democrats were doing when they call it domestic spying. I mean, let's assume for just a moment that what the president is saying is true, and that they are intercepting the international communications of people with known Al-Qaeda connections without a warrant. Okay? First of all, that's not domestic. If you have a flight from Washington to Paris, is that an international flight or a domestic flight?
But these may be conversations involving American citizens who are based in America.
Absolutely. And that was in the very first New York Times story, that some of these conversations involve what are called often U.S. persons. So there's no doubt about that. But I would direct your attention to a piece I did for National Review, which has been republished on National Review Online, about a case called In Re Sealed Case from 2002. It was settled by the FISA Court of Review. And, we all know about the FISA Court. When Congress created the FISA Court in 1978, it anticipated that there could be disputes in the future, and it provided for something called a FISA Court of Review. Interestingly enough, the FISA Court of Review was never, ever met from 1978 to 2002, in which it did meet because there was a dispute between the Bush administration and the FISA Court about the so-called wall and being able to share intelligence between law enforcement and intelligence. And the Court of Review, in its decision in 2002, referred to an earlier case, which I'm sure you've heard of, called the Trong case from 1980, I think. Said the Trong court, as did all the other courts to have decided the issue, held that the President did have inherent authority to conduct warrantless searches to obtain foreign intelligence information. We take for granted that the President does have that authority. Now,
these are searches.
If that's, yeah.
Not wiretap.
Well, the basis there was searches, but I think anybody would argue that if the President has the constitutional authority to break into your house, he also has the authority to tap your telephone.
Well, I still think that there's there are two issues here.
So the issue, so what's going to happen is, and this case, the ACLU tried to get the Supreme Court to listen to it. The Supreme Court declined. That is not the same as the Supreme Court affirming it. I'm not saying that.
Right.
But this case needs, this whole issue needs some sort of judicial review, and it will probably get it somehow, and it's going to have to be the Supreme Court. But the idea to just suggest on the face of it that it's illegal, as Senator Feingold does, because its illegality is the basis for his entire censure resolution, is not correct. There is a serious legal argument to be made that it's legal.
Well, the key word there is argument. There is an argument here, and there are, dozens of constitutional scholars as well who have written letters and signed under statements saying that they believe it is illegal. And the White House obviously has its legal opinion saying that it's not illegal, that indeed it is proper, and that we have these inherent authorities. My whole argument is, looking at the President, who, remember, he said he would run as the uniter, not a divider. He didn't have to say that, but he said that. And I do believe in holding, presidents, particularly, to a higher standard than even your usual senator or member of Congress when it comes to the way they frame debates and the way they talk about things.
Well, look,
and to suggest, and for Dick Cheney, who is vice president for all of us, even though he may not realize that, to say that if you have an argument with this, if you believe it's not legal, that you're actually in favor of protecting Al-Qaeda communications, I think that is quite demagogic. At least it's not fair.
Well, what would you term the Democratic argument that the administration is committing domestic espionage, spying on Americans? Well, that may or may not be true. They don't know whether it's true or not. One thing we should bring up in all this is that nobody knows, very few people know what's going on in this program. I went to the Senate Judiciary Committee, had a hearing on this, I guess on Tuesday morning, and our inspector said, well, passing judgment on the program, the surveillance program, would require knowing what it is. And he doesn't. Orrin Hatch, who was on the committee, who was also a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, said, well, I've been briefed on it. But he was the only guy there who had. So there's a real question. I mean, first of all, these are some of the most secret things in the government, and they should be. But the question is, how much can the administration tell Congress about this to either get them on board or settle this thing one way or the other so they can, run against it?
Well, I'll give you the last word on the issue, on that issue itself. But to me, it seems that you have Senate and House Intelligence Committees, and given the way our republic works, the president's not supposed to really be able to do things that are too secret without there being some degree of oversight. At least not from the public, from the people who represent us. And so I think being able to fully brief the intelligence committees, and if they came out and said, Democrats and Republicans, we've looked at this and we don't see the problem, that'd be good enough for me. And then we could all move on. And speaking of moving on, let's move on to our next topic, if we may. Is that okay?
All right.
I was, I don't want to say tickled, but I was interested in this conference that occurred in Washington earlier this week. A bunch of fundamentalist conservatives came out, and you might remember that a few months ago, the war on Christmas was the talk on Fox News and elsewhere amongst certain conservatives that they believed society was waging war on Kris Kringle and the like. And now it seems to have morphed into a campaign that there is a war on Christianity, a war on Christians. And at this conference, Tom DeLay spoke, and he really got up there and said that the reason why he's being persecuted, and probably used that word, is because he's a Christian. Which to me is really hiding behind one's faith. I haven't seen Jack Abramoff come out and say, they nabbed me because I'm an Orthodox Jew.
Well, he has made a lot of his religion, though.
Well, he does. That's a separate kettle of fish. He has, but he hasn't at least hidden behind it. And so I just wonder, as a fellow who who writes for a conservative magazine and pays attention to this stuff, do you think these guys really have a case that that the American society is generally hostile to Christians, and B, is this a relevant wing of the conservative movement, and if the rest of the movement doesn't buy into this argument, might there be tension?
Well, I don't think it's a. Well, A, they don't have a case, and B, I don't think it's a big part of the conservative movement. I wish I'd known that this was going on. I didn't. Did you know what was going on ahead of time?
No. I only read about this after the fact.
Neither did I. But I will read from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, which had an article about this yesterday, and it said, about 300 people attended the conference Tuesday, significantly fewer than the thousands who have attended in the past. Among the other speakers, other than DeLay, were American Values President Gary Bauer, Eagle Forum founder Phyllis Schlafly, former Ambassador Alan Keyes, and Senator Sam Brownback of Texas, a possible candidate for the 2008 Republican presidential nomination. So, I mean, this is a certain part of the Republican coalition, shall we say. And it's just not that big a part. You got 300 people who come to this, listening to people who used to run for president, including Alan Keyes.
But it's not quite...
And Tom DeLay, who's in trouble now.
It's not quite a fringe, though, either. Right? What do you get? It's somewhere between a fringe and a wing. I don't know what that makes it.
Well, look, the number of people who are willing to actually get up and go do something it probably is a fringe. I mean, look, there may be Christians out there who believe that their religion has been kind of pushed out of the public square, and they're actually correct about that, although that would apply to other religions as well, so it's not specifically anti-Christian. And there are alliances between Christians and, for example, you mentioned Abramoff, Orthodox Jews on some of this stuff. But they clearly didn't feel strongly enough to go to Washington and come to this conference.
Well, I mean, the things that were said, at least according to the Post piece this week, were quite entertaining. You had a fellow named Michael Horowitz, who told the conference that Christians are becoming the Jews of the 21st century. This was a Jew telling the Christians that. And you had others comparing themselves to the Afghan fellow who was nearly, charged with a capital offense for having converted.
This is the kind of stuff, and you enjoy reading it, and it should be reported on, of course. But this is the kind of stuff, in the right wing, you can go to a MoveOn.org rally or go to a Cindy Sheehan appearance, and then you report some of the kooky stuff that was said, and then, do you suggest that is representative of the entire Democratic coalition?
No.
The answer is not.
I'm just asking how significant this block. I mean, Phyllis Schlafly, Gary Bauer, they're not great figures, but they sometimes play a role in Republican presidential primaries, and candidates do court their support.
Well, a role and a decisive role are two different things, and I would certainly say that they do play a role, and they'll play a role in 2008.
Let's move on to our next and last subject.
Final round.
Yes, as Jack Abramoff was being sentenced yesterday for his crimes in Florida, basically 23. He faked a $23 million wire fraud in such an amateurish way.
Right.
You can't believe he ever thought he could get away with it.
This was to buy this Florida gambling interest.
Yes, the
Sun
gambling,
Cruise, right?
Yes, from a fellow who then later was assassinated.
There was a mob hit
involved.
Yes.
And it's separate from the corruption issues.
That really kicked the story up a notch, too, don't you think?
Yeah, we have a lot of Washington scandals, but very few involve
mob hits. Yeah, right.
So this is like K Street meets The Sopranos. In any event, while he was being sentenced, I think he got 5 years, but it may come down lower depending on his
5 years and 10 months.
Yeah, his cooperation up with the investigations here in Washington. The Senate was passing a rather weak lobby reform bill and telling Susan Collins, the Republican chairman of the Government Operations Committee, or Government Affairs, Homeland Security, that they would not take her proposal to set up an independent ethics ombuds person.
Right.
Basically they were banning, hamburgers. You can't get a hamburger from a lobbyist. It really wouldn't change things much here.
Right.
So while this is all going on, while Abramoff is being indicted, you want to raise the point now that really the significant thing to watch is not the cop-out on lobbying reform, but what's coming down the pike with campaign finance reform.
Right,
so
right.
Take it away.
Well, first of all, the lobbying reform is weak, and it's kind of where we figured it would be once it was all over, which is for greater transparency, which probably is all that we actually needed. I mean, because all the stuff that Abramoff did is already illegal. So, I don't think we needed we certainly needed more transparency, just as we did with campaign finance. Well, I'm not sure we needed a lot else.
There was the proposal to get rid of private transportation, which is something, for members of Congress, you can't fly in corporate jets or be, flown or by lobbyists.
Right.
And to me, I think that's a good idea. It makes sense if a member of Congress needs to take a trip overseas to do his job. Right. I say give him or her the money to do it. And if they want to go overseas for a vacation, they should pay for it like every other American.
Right.
And they can take gifts from members of their family and close friends, but not from the people who lobby them. I mean, I think that should have been banned, and they took a big dive by dodging that. But anyways, let's talk about
on campaign. What's happening is we are getting closer to a move in the House and then later in the Senate to crack down on 527s, the huge groups outside the party groups that could take unlimited contributions. In 2004, George Soros gave $20 million to America Coming Together, which was the biggest such group on the Democratic side, and Split Vote Veterans for Truth was the most famous 527 on the Republican side, which raised a huge amount of money after its ads began airing, mostly in small contributions, but had its biggest impact really with the first $300,000 or $400,000 of its expenditures.
And how much did it get at the end of the day?
Swift Vote Veterans?
Yeah.
20 million?
Yeah.
I think maybe one-tenth of America Coming Together. Actually, what was interesting about Swift Vote Veterans is they get $100,000 from T. Boone Pickens and $100,000 from Bob Perry, two Texas Republicans, and they put on this ad, and they get a huge amount of influence with it. And basically what happens is, at that point, small contributions begin pouring in from around the country, and a lot of what they do, at the end is try to figure out what to do with all the money that's come in, because they'd already said their piece.
Now, these 527s came about after the McCain-Feingold reform bill got rid of soft money.
Well, let's just
explain soft money for 1 second.
Well, it forbade, McCain-Feingold forbade people from giving unlimited contributions, so-called soft money, to the political party. So you could already only give $2,000 to the George W. Bush for President campaign.
That's what's called hard money.
Hard money.
And this goes back to campaign bills from after
1974.
After Nixon, and the whole point was to limit the amount of money any one individual could give on the theory that money buys access and influence, and if no one could give more than $1,000, $2,000, you couldn't buy that much influence.
And that campaign finance law was tested in court in a famous case called Buckley v. Vallejo, and basically giving contributions to the parties was essentially defined as an act of political speech, and it was protected as such. And so for years and years, you were able to give huge amounts to the political parties.
So you could give $2,000 to George Bush or to John Kerry.
That's right.
But then you could give $1 million if you had that to give to the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, which would then use to elect George Bush or John Kerry, and they, of course, would know who was giving the $1 million.
Of course. So McCain-Feingold outlawed those unlimited contributions to the party. But the dirty little secret of campaign finance was that
there's only one?
Democrats, even though they had the images of the party of the little guy, were far more dependent than Republicans on 7- and 8-figure contributions from their mega donors, and Republicans, even though they had the reputations of the party of the plutocrats, had a much bigger base of small, that is $200 and under, donors. So McCain-Feingold hurt Democrats quite a lot, and they had to keep their big donors in the game. So people like Soros, Peter Lewis, Stephen Bing, a lot of the big cheeses in the Democratic money-giving world started pouring money into these 527s. So then John McCain felt that McCain-Feingold should have applied to 527s, and he blamed the Federal Elections Commission for not applying it to 527s.
He was very mad about that.
He was very angry about it. But the FEC, led by a conservative named Brad Smith, decided not to do so. So the 527s were a big player in 2004. So the question is, what are we going to do about it now? And, for years and years, Republicans resisted campaign finance reform on principle. They said, look, being able to give to parties is an act of political free speech. Democrats felt that it should be limited. Now what you have is
and in those days, Republicans routinely raised more money overall than Democrats.
As they do now, with the exception of these 527s. I mean, Republicans raised more last year if you took the 527s out. So anyway, what has happened is there's a move for campaign finance reform. McCain, of course, again, is leading this time the move to crack down on the 527s. One would expect and hope that the Republican opponents of campaign finance reform would say, look, McCain-Feingold was a bad thing. We don't need to extend it now to 527s. But that's not the case, because Republicans are afraid that Democrats are going to use those 527s to beat the hell out of them in 2008. So Republicans who had been speaking out against the regulation of the political system, speaking out on principle, have now abandoned their principles and are in favor of cracking down on the 527s. On the other hand, Democrats who passionately believed in trying to keep big money out of politics have now decided that these 527s should continue to be allowed to accept these contributions. So both sides have completely flipped over on this, abandoned whatever principles they had, and it looks like we are headed toward regulation of the 527s. I've been told that definitely a majority of Republicans in the House, and not only a majority, but maybe every Republican in the Senate would vote to impose limits on 527s.
And this actually brings me back in a weird way to lobbying reform. And that I thought one of the key things about lobbying reform is that it really should be connected to campaign finance reform.
Why did you think that? I'm curious.
Well, the problem is not that lobbyists take a member of Congress out to a baseball game or buy them a fancy lunch. The issue is that lobbyists have a tremendous influence when it comes to raising campaign funds for members of Congress. They hold, you've been to these. They hold these receptions here in town where lobbyists feel they have to come. They have to, or they round up others, and they, while they themselves can only give $2,000, they are actually raising, $100,000, $200,000 at a clip for members of Congress. I mean, I had one fellow who lobbies on an issue that's not Republican, not Democratic, not left or right. I won't identify him, but he recently walked into a meeting with a member of Congress, and he said, wanted to talk about an issue involving a health care pension type thing, and the guy said, how much money can you raise for me? This happened to be Republican. I'm sure this happens on the Democratic side as well. And he said, well, actually, our group doesn't do that. And the member of Congress looked at him and said, oh, well, then you'll want to talk to Joe over there. Basically sent him to an intern. And so lobbyists have this, that's where the clout is. The clout is being able to raise money. And at the end of the day, you get rid of the 527s. And if you have a system where one side or the other...
But these corporate types weren't giving money to the 527s.
No, they're not.
I mean, the 527s were basically supported by unions. There were some big union-supported 527s, and then there was the kind of glamour 527 like America Coming Together.
Right.
And so how does that change that? What's the scenario you were just talking about?
Well, the difference is when you have people lobbying who basically are saying, we want you to think about this legislation, and members of Congress are basically depending on these people to raise money from them. Listen, I'm not saying that the 527s can leverage their contributions as well as could the people with soft money, as could, of course, the Bush pioneers, people who have the ability to go out there and
the pioneers were just what we call bundling.
Yeah, bundling.
They were,
exactly.
And that's raising money within the $2,000 hard money limit, right?
Yes, and the lobbyists are
which should be legal, right?
Are bundling as well. I'm not sure it actually should be legal. If you want to have a system where one side who is willing to say sell out, just use that word, to corporate interests and say we're happy to listen to you if you raise money for us.
Right.
Which is a form, if not, it may not be illegal, but certainly is a form of institutional corruption. I think then perhaps laws should be changed to prevent that from happening.
I mean, you have do you want to say that a company like General Electric or Microsoft or an Indian tribe, which has a lot of issues in front of the government, a lot of things the government does affects those companies, and which in turn affects thousands and thousands of employees? I mean, they have to deal. Those people, those companies should have a voice in what the government does, right?
They should not be able to buy a voice that's larger or bigger than the other people on the other side of those issues.
Well, let me ask you this. A lot of conservatives think that the most passionate campaign finance reformers, what they're doing McCain-Feingold and they 527s, but what they really want, where they really want to go, is public financing of campaigns. Is that what you want?
Yeah, I think they have it in Maine. I think they have it in Arizona now. They have some states where if you raise a certain amount of money on your own, then you get public financing. You don't have to go to lobbyists or private interests. Yeah, we'll give some nuts the ability to run for office who may not have, who might not have been able to do so previously. But I think that's a small price to pay for making sure that you don't have the scenario that I just described, where when someone comes in to talk about the public's business, the first question out of a member's mouth is, how much money can you raise from it?
I just simply do not believe that. If George Soros wants to give $20 million to America Coming Together, or if he wanted to give $20 million to the Democratic Party, if it were actually legal, that would be fine with me. I mean, look, if it could be, if Soros were able to give that money to the party, certainly the Republicans would have launched a campaign saying the Democratic Party bought and paid for by George Soros, and the whole thing would have worked itself out. It could have become a liability for Democrats, but it would have worked itself out inside the political system without more laws to deal with it. So, look, every time you impose one of these laws, it makes the system crazier, which tells you that the ultimate goal, really, of the reformers is total public financing of campaigns, which I think is just unconstitutional.
Well, it is a system that's working very well on the state level in Maine and Arizona. These are models, and if viewers want more, they should go look at those and see if those systems sound a little bit better than a system in which members of Congress turn to lobbyists and say, raise money for me and then bring me your bills, which undoubtedly is happening. I'm not saying everyone does it, but enough to make me desire a different way of doing business here. Anyway, I'm going to take the last word on that.
You got
it. And thank you so much for becoming a proud member of the few and the strong, those of us at Blogging Heads TV.
It's good to be a proud member of Blogging Heads TV.
Okay, and now we're going to say goodbye and click off, and I'll see you next time
in
New York.
Bye, David.